I want to begin this series of videos by reiterating the challenge I wish to undertake. Indeed, a lot of people have made videos criticizing the alt-right. But as I pointed out in my introduction video, I feel that these attacks on the alt-right have been largely disingenuous, and have focused either on psychoanalyzing individual members of the alt-right, or have focused on equivocating and nitpicking the alt-right's premises, in order to turn around and once more cast aspersion onto their motives. In this video series, I intend to do neither. Once more, for the sake of argument, I intend to fully concede the premise that there may indeed be large differences between the races, and that these differences could impede the social cohesion of society. Now, this is not to say that I embrace these premises in real life, but for the sake of argument, and for the sake of actually critiquing the essence of the alt-right, I think this concession is necessary. It gets me around the stale talking points that are endlessly reiterated on both sides of this debate, either by the left-wing critics of the alt-right or the right-wing critics of the alt-right. I want to take a different tract and get at the myriad different strategic and philosophical flaws that beset the alt-right movement, even if every one of their premises about race and society are true. Now, this particular video series will take the form of 7 videos covering different strategic and philosophical flaws with the alt-right as it exists, followed by one final video where I explain what some solutions might look like. However, because this critique is directed at the philosophy and the organization of the alt-right itself, and not at the actual premises that the alt-right relies on, I'm forced to begin with some explanation of what the alt-right is, where it came from, who it opposes, and what it hopes to accomplish, before I can begin my critique of the movement properly. So what is the alt-right? How has it been successful? And more importantly, what does it want to accomplish? Well, as I have said in several other videos, the alt-right is mainly a quasi-nationalist movement focused on racial identity politics, specifically the identity politics of white Westerners. It's broadly reactionary in its philosophy, drawing from various critics of the Enlightenment, nationalist in its political persuasion, and populist in its organization and contempt for most modern institutions, be they government, corporate, or academic. In many ways, its origin in the 21st century is a confluence of earlier 20th century political movements that many thought were dead. Beginning with the American paleoconservatives, the alt-right also draws a number of its ideas from European national fronts, as well as early American working-class populism, using as a common uniting principle the concept of a unified European and white identity, and with a common enemy of the multicultural, progressive, and globalist movements who see white and European identity as a barrier towards future progress towards world government, socialism, and perhaps even communism. The movement now functions as a combination of older thinkers such as Jared Taylor and Ramsey Paul, and a new batch of millennial voices online, starting with websites like The Right Stuff, YouTubers like Millennial Woes or Tara McCarthy, and ending in outright political activists like Richard Spencer. And I think in this transition from the paleoconservative and nationalist ideas to the current inception of the alt-right, we've seen a number of changes. The movement has largely shifted away from complaints about policy and economics, and has almost entirely focused on identity, specifically racial identity, as the main unifying characteristic and motivating impetus of the political cause. Moreover, the new alt-right has largely stood down from localist and grassroots politics, and has instead reimagined itself as a cultural force online, using humor and a large amount of silly memes to communicate its purpose, and to signal against the mainstream. Now, to a large extent, many of these changes could be seen as the direct influence of leaders like Jared Taylor, who had an understanding of the power of identity politics that in retrospect makes him seem a little ahead of his times. But still, much of this identitarianism found in the alt-right is more closely linked to similar countercultural identitarian movements on the left, specifically those found in the LGBT and African American community. Indeed, given the success of identitarian countercultural movements on the left, and among every ethnicity in the left coalition, It really shouldn't be surprising that some kind of similar counter-reaction would eventually happen on the right. Now, I know many people in the Sargon of Akkad and Armored Skeptic and Spinosaurus kin crowd on YouTube love to call the alt-right right-wing SJWs, pointing out, of course, that the alt-right is cashing in on the same concept of identity politics, commonly found in universities and other leftist circles. And indeed, there is some truth to this, but of course, the critique is much less damaging than a lot of internet libertarians and liberals think it is. The identity politics used by the left has been overwhelmingly politically successful, and have in many ways locked out their opposition from holding political power in a lot of modern institutions. If the white identity politics of the alt-right has even a fraction of that success, they'll be laughing their way to the bank, in spite of all the gadflies on YouTube complaining about how it's not individualistic enough. Identity politics is powerful, and people discount that at their own risk. And I think pointing this fact out really brings me to the second part of this talk, which is largely a discussion of why the alt-right has succeeded and why I think it will continue to succeed. I mean, I'm not making this video for nothing. Indeed, I see the alt-right as one of the forces politically that will survive well into the 21st century. Indeed, I expect the alt-right to outlive most of the liberal movements that critique it. I don't expect to see very many anarcho-capitalists in 50 years. I don't expect to see very many cultural libertarians in 50 years. But I imagine that some form of the alt-right will be around, and may even be the dominant force on the right. So a very interesting question immediately presents itself. What is the alt-right doing right? We have to step back and recognize that they've succeeded in places where most other nationalist and paleoconservative forces have failed. And I think the reason why the alt-right's been so successful is they've really made themselves masters of exploiting the left's own mistakes, and also of learning from the left's victories. First, I think the alt-right was just the first movement to really realize and see the left's game for what it really was. To understand how the left wing had changed political discourse, and as opposed to just pine for previous times, actually adapt to it. So much of the left's power in conversation came from the insinuation that their opponents were racist, sexist, or some other form of bigot. Often it wasn't said explicitly, but it didn't need to be said explicitly, because the right was ever so willing to apologize. Moreover, the right wing thought that somehow cathartically complaining about the left's abuses of these labels, racist, bigot, would somehow be a political winner for them. That somehow, if they said to themselves, "It's not fair they call us racist," enough, the political tides would turn, and this weapon would somehow be taken off the table. And of course, that never happened. And I think it was really the alt-right who realized the dimensions of this game, that the apology itself was the weapon that the left seek to extract. Apologies set the tone for a conversation, and if they can be procured easily, much of the framing that surrounds the topic can be controlled. And you can see this in early Trump interactions with the media. When somebody called him racist, he just called them racist right back. Or he owned what he said and doubled down. And when your opponent does that, the power that racist has against them evaporates. It just becomes one more insult. And I know people will say Gamergate understood this before the alt-right, but largely many of the leaders of Gamergate, like Sargon of Akkad, still take up moderate positions and concede the problem of racism to their opponents. I would argue it is this wedge in particular that the progressive community will eventually use to erode and fracture the skeptic and Gamergate community that has arisen in the last 2 or 3 years. The alt-right, which simply agrees and amplifies their opponent's suggestions, will never have to deal with this problem. The second thing I really think the alt-right understood was just how powerful a cultural movement could be, and from that baseline, exactly how to run a counterculture. Now, there's an enormous amount of unwarranted self-aggrandizement in the alt-right currently over the great meme war of 2016, but there is a kernel of truth here, namely that the alt-right was the first movement to really understand and use the methods that the left had developed to destigmatize things that were previously considered taboo, and simultaneously point out and highlight the power structures held by the opposition, while satirizing their incompetence. The alt-right was the first group opposed to progressives who really understood how Jon Stewart and Will and Grace accomplished what 20 or 30 years of gender studies papers could not. And starting from that understanding, they developed tactics that were truly effective. The movement was able to very effectively use culture jamming, a practice where serious icons or subjects are shown in a humorous light, in order to destigmatize a lot of topics they wanted to talk about concerning race that would have ordinarily been very taboo to bring up in a serious context. This, combined with a large amount of sarcasm, allowed many activists to shift the Overton window in a lot of online forums, very effectively. And of course, this was straight out of the left's handbook. This is how most destigmatization efforts that the left ran over the last 50 years worked. First, the concept was introduced as humor, later it was introduced seriously. But for all of these successes, we're left at the end of the day wondering what the alt-right wants, and if they can even be successful in fighting the forces that are arrayed against them. When asked honestly about what their ultimate objectives are, most modern alt-righters will admit that they want an ethnostate, a homogeneous or near-homogeneous society that can be run for the express interests of white people or people of ethnic European origin. The alt-right wants to build a society very much like the societies that existed in Europe prior to 1965, that existed in America before the 1950s. It sounds outrageous, but when you think about it, most other countries outside of America and Western Europe are founded and operate along similar principles. Along principles that put one ethnic group, the primary ethnic group, at the center of political life and discourse. In most countries, it goes without saying that that ethnic group will be preserved in its dominance across the geographic territory of the nation, and no further debate is really entertained. Pair that with the manifest failings that most Western multiracial projects have experienced over the last 15 years, and the political platform and ultimate objective of the alt-right seems, well, almost reasonable, leaving aside the paranoid fantasies that the opponents of the alt-right on the left usually bring up about them wanting to ship all minorities into camps. Couldn't something like a white ethnostate be worked towards gradually? Is that a totally insane objective to expect, and perhaps even achieve? And here I might offer a little sympathy for the devil. The alt-right is composed mainly of well-meaning, underemployed, middle-class white men who in many other societies and at many other times would have a much better deal than they do right now. For all the manifest problems that a native Turk or Chinese man in his own society, he doesn't have his own elites telling him that his ethnic group is responsible for most of society's problems. Moreover, there isn't an explicit policy that will make his ethnic group and his children minorities in that country within the next half century. At this stage, the average white middle-class male in his 20s is offered little more than nihilism, video games, and pornography. Consumption is everywhere, but wealth seems eternally out of reach. And while pleasure is ever present, there is no meaning. There is no community, and that's a hollow existence. A hollower existence than was available to a similar person 50 years ago. But of course, the sympathy I'm offering here doesn't go very far to answering the central question. Does the alt-right movement as it exists hold the answer? Can a racial identitarian movement built on populism and using an uncanny ability to wield counterculture through internet memes possibly be the first step in creating an ethnically homogeneous society that addresses the lack of meaning and community in modern society, that builds the new civilization that many of the more intellectual members of the alt-right devoutly hope for? And it is on this common ground where I will begin my critique, because I deeply sympathize with the desire for a community based in meaning, for a community built on purpose, and for a community in full communion with its own ancestors and its own descendants. But for that very reason, we have to look at the alt-right as a movement and as a philosophy and ask if it is capable of generating that and building it. Can the alt-right win the grand civilizational game that it has before it? The quest for the West's own cultural rebirth? And on this point, I am deeply pessimistic. At the end of my last video, I ended with one central analogy, which painted the central quest of civilizational renewal and civilizational revival as a game that the alt-right was looking to win through the use of racial identity politics. In coming to the main portion of my video, I've decided to largely keep this analogy, discussing the movement and philosophy of the alt-right as if it were a group of chess pieces on a chessboard, and examining each of the individual problems with the alt-right by reference to the individual chess pieces, starting at the most basic level with problems in the grassroots, working up towards problems strategically and sociologically with the leadership, and ending, finally, with the difficult philosophical problems a movement based on racial populism has. I thought this would be an interesting way to keep the thoughts organized, but at any rate, the first problem with the alt-right begins at the popular level. And our analysis of the great game begins with the pawns. The problem of populism. And the problem, put succinctly, is just this. Regardless of what decisions the alt-right leadership makes in terms of its tactics, strategy, or marketing, populism and democracy will never bring a movement like this to power in a modern, first world Western country. Now, I fully realize that upon repeating this criticism, a lot of the higher up and more intellectual people in the alt-right are going to scoff. Many of them are fully aware of the problems with democracy and the problems that democracy and popular forms of action pose to their particular movements. But I think that for the ordinary viewer, especially the ordinary alt-right viewer, it's important to shut this door and demonstrate the myriad reasons why this door has to be shut before we can go forward and critique the larger and more abstract problems that the alt-right has, and why it won't be able to accomplish its vision. Because especially after the election of Donald Trump and in the UK Brexit, a lot of people on the dissident right and even the alt-right seem to believe that a popular groundswell might indeed be their salvation. A lot of people might not believe that the alt-right has to have some kind of coherent philosophy or an ability to develop reliable leadership, because they're under the impression that populism, the election victories, will inevitably restore the West to its rightful place. The borders will shut, the immigrants will go back to their country of origin, and no further radical action really needs to be entertained, least of all the development of some kind of dynamic leader that would have to row hard against cultural changes in the West and unseat the reigning philosophy of consumeristic individualism. From this vantage point, someone anticipating a popular victory or a democratic victory could imagine that the question of nihilism and lack of meaning and purpose in society might be a question for later generations. Close the border, restore ethnic homogeny, and we'll sort the rest of the hard philosophical questions out later. But unfortunately, nothing is going to be that easy, because there is no democratic or populist victory available to a movement like the alt-right in any form that they would recognize. And every now and again you meet an alt-righter who is just gobsmacked that Trump is not executing on a lot of the promises he made to his constituencies, especially a lot of the promises he made along the lines of ensuring that nationalist and ethno-nationalist priorities would come before the priorities of globalization. And people talked about this like it's a spot of bad luck or even a betrayal, that Trump was just the wrong choice and maybe another leader would have done differently. But really, this has nothing to do with luck. This has to do with culture, with political incentives, and how the alt-right and how nationalist movements generally are organized in the modern world. Politicians are not mindless robots that behave at the behest of the desires of their constituents. Politicians react to incentives, and those incentives come in the form of pressure, either political pressure from below in the long term, or pressure from above in the form of culture and cultural elites. The alt-right at this stage is still, for everything, a movement of the dispossessed, a movement of unemployed men, a movement of childless women, a movement of dispossessed factory workers, and the lost working class. These are groups with no window into high culture, or the media that reproduces culture, and the institutions that represent them have almost no influence among elite decision makers. These people have no power in the corporate world, in the academic world, and even in the many appointed offices in government. All that remains for a right-wing populist movement such as this is to put a single leader atop an apparatus that is totally culturally opposed to the objectives that given leader was elected to fulfill. It doesn't take a psychologist, a sociologist, or a political scientist to realize that in that situation, the given elected leader is going to realize who holds the real reins of power and make his decisions accordingly. And for all the alt-right's understanding of how culture jamming and memes can be used to short-circuit taboos at a cultural level, they seem to have made the fundamental cultural mistake that the previous conservative movement before them made, namely, believing that political swings at an electoral level can be an effective proxy by which to push back long-term cultural and demographic changes. Now, I think a lot of alt-righters will agree with me when I point out that these cultural changes and demographic changes brought by immigration were facilitated and accomplished only because a large majority of cultural elites saw these changes as good. But there seems to be some kind of resistance to realizing the rather obvious corollary, that these cultural trends will only be pushed back once America has a different cultural elite that thinks that they should be pushed back. Now, I'm sure a lot of people on the alt-right might agree with this proposition, but I'm left speculating how they believe a popular movement is going to accomplish a change in the cultural attitudes of elites. I mean, one hypothetical way it could occur is that cultural trends popular among the dispossessed middle class and aging working class will somehow filter up into elite minds. But of course, this is contrary to how we've seen most cultural trends form. In the operation of normal society, most of the time, ideas, opinions, and cultural trends filter from the upper and elite classes down to the lower and working classes. Seeing a reverse trend would be very rare, and moreover, hoping for one would be utterly futile. But of course, there is potentially another option. If you can't convince the current cultural elites, perhaps, through some ingenious political manipulation, the people of this burgeoning populist movement might come to replace them, working their way up slowly but surely. I mean, things like this have happened historically in certain circumstances. It's rare. Every now and again, you get some kind of burgeoning middle class, some enthusiastic, up-and-coming ethnic group that by its own gumption works its way into a leadership position in a leadership system that was formerly opposed to it. But to answer this possibility, I think we need to do nothing more than just look at the modern alt-right and ask ourselves if this is possible with the people they have in their populist movement. Now, I know other alt-right figures have pointed this out, but the white working class that brought Donald J. Trump into the White House is not the white working class of the 1950s. It is a deeply, deeply troubled demographic. It has experienced the worst aspects of modernity over the last 40 years. Gone are the two-parent families, the 8 hours of hard union labor followed by service at the community center. Gone are the days of Grange halls and family farms, of the middle American factory worker with the white picket fence. Modern white America has caught some of the worst aspects of modernity. Drug culture is prevalent. Church attendance is dropping. Illegitimacy rates are rising, almost to the point where we could say that any connection to the previous American culture of the 1950s and earlier eras is almost entirely sentimental. These are not people ready to move into semi-professional and professional roles in some kind of new dispensation. They can barely hold their own ground where they stand. And much could be said for the same modern unemployed NEET, the guy living in his parents' basement, listening to Millennial Woes and Richard Spencer. These people aren't ready for any upward mobility, and they certainly aren't ready to push back against the nihilism of modernity. In fact, they're victims of it. Sure, they'll retweet Donald Trump and Pepe memes, but don't expect them to get involved in municipal politics. And so, for all its ability in the meme wars, the alt-right in its present populist form remains singularly unable to influence elite culture. And without elite culture, politicians placed in office through momentary populist swells will feel absolutely no pressure to carry out counter-progressive policies. Now here I must address one last potential criticism. What about continued populist efforts? Not simply a swell, but a group of people who return to the polls again and again and again in order to hold any number of politicians' feet to the fire. Certainly, over a long enough time frame, this would have effects. And in the abstract, there's some truth to it. Over a long enough time frame, a populist movement might have some effect on politicians. But here is the central problem. The alt-right, and indeed all nationalist populism in the West, cannot make a long-term, credible political threat. The demographics simply will not allow it. I certainly don't need to explain to the movement that invented the hashtag white genocide that in almost all Western countries, the native population is a quickly dwindling percentage of the total population of those countries. Moreover, now that the era of mass migration has moved the analysis of political demographics from a national scale to an international scale, the proportion of the world's population that is white is decreasing almost at an exponential rate. And since the world population can easily be brought to any particular country as new voters, the overall effect is not hard to see. And in many ways, the long-term career of politicians depends on analyzing the value of demographics and having certain demographic groups on their side. Thus, a prudent democratic politician might ask himself whether it's a good idea or a wise idea to be more popular among Africans than among Europeans. Sort of in a similar way that a stockbroker might wonder whether it's smarter to buy Apple or Google. Now, I'm sure people have seen demographic projections of the total population of Africa versus the total population of Europe. It's scary, but looking from the perspective of an international politician, at this graph, would you want to own stock in the European demographic or the African one? Again, the politicians would have to be stupid to not know where their interests were ultimately. Populist nationalist movements without highly trained elite vanguards will always fail, and this problem is only compounded by the existence of these stark demographic trends worldwide. Current attempts to push back against politicians promoting large-scale immigration into Europe have failed, which means that Europe is likely to be in the same position that America is, namely, with a white population that is very quickly dwindling to a smaller percentage of the population. Therefore, as these populist nationalist movements increase their percentage of whites, they will nonetheless continue to decrease in overall power. And here, I'm tempted to quote Larry the Liquidator from one of my favorite movies, Other People's Money, on how you go bankrupt.
We're dead, all right. We're just not broke. And do you know the surest way to go broke? Keep getting an increasing share of a shrinking market. Down the tubes, slow but sure.
And indeed, just like that, populism is doomed. And this creates the last problem. As nationalist populist movements continue to spring up and fail, in their ambitions to take power at a national level, a new class of cynical and paranoid ex-nationalists will emerge in the wake of these failures, along with being increasingly vulnerable to slipping further into the vices of modernity, such as pornography, video games, and drugs. These cynical individuals will be incredibly easy to manipulate, and will be looking for any radical mechanism to strike back at the society they felt betrayed them. A recipe not for a constructive nationalist movement, but only chaos and disorder. The larger political objectives of the alt-right can only be accomplished once some effort has been put not only into solving the manifest dysfunction of the middle and working classes, but also towards influencing and creating new narratives inside the elite, academic, and corporate classes. The nihilism of both of these groups must be confronted, and it can only be confronted by some type of elite intellectual vanguard, some set of leaders willing to be responsible and take charge. But as I will review in later sections, the creation of such a vanguard has its own set of problems for the alt-right. I will begin this next installment of the series, concerning the alt-right, where the previous installment left off, with the basic observation that the alt-right's goals of civilizational renewal cannot be accomplished through populism and popular election victories. Here the observations came broadly in two forms. First, in pointing out that elected politicians will have almost no incentive to row hard against cultural and demographic trends, regardless of whether they are elected in a sudden burst of nationalist or ethno-nationalist populism. Secondly, the concept that some popular nationalist groundswell from the lower middle class and working class could somehow overwhelm and replace elite cultures through long-term grassroots action is similarly impossible, since the very subjects, the middle and working class, have been the primary victims of the nihilism and indolence brought about by the development of late modernity. As such, these classes cannot be relied upon either to hold politicians' feet to the fire in a political sense, or to rise up and retake the culture in a gradualist sense. What we're left with after this is simply a population that cannot by its own means help itself out of the hole that modern post-sexual revolution consumeristic culture has put it in. It can certainly rage against all of the injustices committed against it, but without some outside force coming in to cure this popular movement of its own nihilism and lazy disorganization, no nationalist movement, alt-right or otherwise, will go anywhere, either towards ultimate political victory or to the restoration of Western civilization, which is supposedly the alt-right's final goal. In other words, election victories will not save you from the need to confront the myriad leadership and philosophical challenges of starting a new ideological movement. But of course, I know full well that I'm not telling any of the more intelligent or thoughtful members of the alt-right anything they don't already know. Sure, the average poster on r/the Donald might be gobsmacked that political victories aren't going to turn things around, but the thought leaders know better. They know that the only way a movement like this will succeed is from a new class of leaders who can take charge. And sure enough, I've heard this hope repeated again and again when it's come to thinkers on the alt-right, that some great leader or set of leaders is going to come marching in and set things right. I've long called this type of hope or this type of strategy the white knight principle. Now I know on the internet, white knight has associations with feminism and the sort of beta orbiters of desperate men who hang around feminist celebrities in order to curry favor. But really, when I talk about white knight in this sense, in the sense that I'm describing the principle and the strategy of waiting for some kind of dynamic leader, I really mean it in the older sense. In the older sense where white knight meant any kind of archetypical hero or leader who emerges out of nowhere into a totally disordered, chaotic community in extreme need, sets everything right, and subsequently returns that society from crisis back to its former glory and order. Of course, there are many instances of this white knight archetype, anywhere from the legends of King Arthur to the movies of Clint Eastwood and John Wayne. And it's not just mythological. Many similar figures exist in history, such as Cincinnatus and Jan Sobieski. Historical need and hardship has a tendency of creating great men. And therefore, the white knight isn't a myth, it's an actual historical force. But when we look at the alt-right and the movement of racial identity politics, is this hope that a dynamic and heroic leader, or even set of leaders, will emerge from their own crisis and need even possible? Should the good people of the alt-right be looking towards the horizon for a Lancelot or Shane to come galumphing in and save them? Well, if you can't anticipate my answer, this really brings me to this video's main problem that the alt-right faces. And that is that the alt-right is incapable of recruiting, attracting, or developing the leaders it needs to facilitate its own success. Now, of course, here I anticipate that there'll be a large amount of pushback from many of the leaders of the alt-right, especially on the internet. But I hear similar sentiments from alt-right commenters on Twitter, and alt-right dissidents that happen to show up in my comments section. There's a certain disappointment in the current crop of alt-right leaders, and a general pessimism that any new, more dynamic leaders will emerge from the fray. One commenter in particular, Jolly Crocodile, has been very quick to point out that the alt-right's current leaders, ranging from Richard Spencer, Jared Taylor, and Greg Johnson, have not exactly been elites at the top of their form. In many ways, they look like elements of a weird counterculture, a motley crew of outsiders, not really the leaders of men. And to put a fine point on it, 2 out of the 3 leaders I mentioned don't even have families, well in their 30s. And that's at the head of a movement that makes pronatalism one of its primary causes. These people might be a good start in a meme war, in appealing to other unemployed NEETs, but they're not exactly going to be calling forth a cavalry charge on the siege of Vienna anytime soon. If the heroic generation of alt-right leadership is to come, it certainly hasn't arrived yet. But why not? Is there something that's stopping it from emerging? Okay, alright, so we can work through this. This isn't rocket science, because there's basically only 2 ways you get new leaders. You can either recruit new people to your cause, either through intentional recruitment efforts or red pilling or just by events, or you can train new leaders. Find people of a very young age and make sure you impart to them the qualities of leadership. But the alt-right, given its identity as a highly taboo, racialist identitarian movement, has incredibly difficult times doing both of these things. First, on the recruitment side, and here I think it's obvious, there's a reason why most of the alt-right leaders look like countercultural weirdos. And that's because despite all of the movement's gains to this point, the alt-right still drives the majority of its recruitment through communities of dispossessed and alienated individuals. People who, as I like to say, have caught in the rough edge of modernity. They've seen the true nihilistic face of modern society, and because of that they have rebounded into something that they've seen as an antidote, namely an identitarian movement made for them. And I say this with a lot of respect for people like Millennial Woes, but there's only so far that recruitment from communities like this is really going to take you. The alt-right can red pill NEETs, it can red pill angsty young white men and former factory workers, but when it comes to professionals, it's really going to have a difficult time. And those professional classes are where the real potential for effective and heroic leadership come from people who've already been trained to take those kind of roles in their professional and personal lives. Memes and cynical YouTubers aren't going to reach those people very effectively. And I know I've talked to a lot of commenters, a lot of alt-right commenters who are wondering why the alt-right leaders don't look more like middle America, don't all have 5 kids in a white picket fence. And, well, frankly, I think the answer is obvious. In addition to the sort of catch-22 problem of not having the more normal leaders that might interact and impress upon communities of middle-class professionals with families, there also is the more primary problem that middle-class families just have too much to lose, joining up with a highly taboo racialist movement. A 37-year-old father of 4 is not going to risk it voicing opinions that could get him fired. He has too much responsibility for that. I mean, people can whine about this being unfair or just the result of circumstances, but at the end of the day, the alt-right is effectively locked out of contact and recruitment inside what people on the internet might call normie communities. And by that, I mean middle-class professionals. And these communities of middle-class professionals are where elite, heroic leaders come from. You know, a lot is said about the rise of the left, and even the left sympathetic to Marxism in the 20th century. But for the most part, during the early 20th century, when this was a fringe movement, when most of the people reading the Communist Manifesto were weirdos who didn't like society anyway, hard left movements were very ineffective at taking institutions and preserving power, because their leadership was was of such an uncharismatic and unprofessional quality. It wasn't really until the late 20s and 30s, at which point the left began recruiting Parsons' daughters and well-meaning social justice activists, that the progressive and left movement could really transform itself from a fringe counterculture to something that could actually occupy high positions in corporations and government. And recruiting those type of people is just not something the alt-right has available to it anytime in the near future. Okay, so what about the alternative? Training and educating a new leadership from much younger individuals. Training individuals who are still fresh-faced and idealistic and haven't yet fallen into a cynical internet subculture. But once more, the alt-right doesn't have the ability to educate and train individuals, nor can it easily develop one. Now, I know in the last 2 years, ethno-nationalist movements have had incredible success in reaching out to young people. There's a lot of enthusiasm in the Twitterverse, a lot of teens and 20-year-olds on 4chan that support the movement. But coaxing people into a political movement that largely consists of shitposting and making silly memes is very different than developing minds and mentoring new talent. And I hear leaders talk about developing leadership, like developing leadership in the intellectual sense is just like doing political activism in a different way. But indeed, speaking as an academic, the two are completely different. Political activism, for the most part, is marketing. It's a low investment activity. Educating and training someone involves bringing discipline to bear. That can only come from committed teachers, training people in close networks. And I just don't see the capacity to generate that kind of commitment on the alt-right, nor do I see it emerging. Now, I think in an ideal world, what a movement like the alt-right would do, and what the left in fact did in the early 20th century, is to use the apparatus of educational institutions to piggyback the training of new ideological leaders. And here, I don't need to remind people of the very important role universities have had in the left's own rise to political dominance. But for those alt-righters who think they're going to be able to infiltrate modern educational institutions, I'm afraid they're out of luck. The left is fully aware of the importance of education, and there is no way they're going to allow cells, neo-identitarian white nationalists, into their institutions to train a new generation of young people. They know this trick because they've done it themselves, and they're not going to let their opponents turn the tables on them. So what the alt-right is really left with is the prospect of training up new leadership with no institutional support, and that means very close networks, where supremely dedicated older individuals sacrifice an enormous amount of their time, monk-like, to the training and upbringing of new individuals. And there's nothing that can facilitate that in a loosely aligned internet community. So as we see, the alt-right really has no mechanism for generating new leaders, and as such they shouldn't expect some white knight to come over the hill to save them. Any hope that they'll achieve their objectives by a highly organized, motivated, and heroic individual is really very unlikely to happen. But I can already anticipate an objection to this, and indeed to the first two problems that I've made videos about. Aren't these tactical concerns? What do they really have to do with the essence of the alt-right, the essence of a racial identitarian movement? Well, I think what this video and the last one have really pointed to is an absence, or at least a lack of focus in the alt-right, in what really is the problem, what really is the central issue. In both cases, the political ambitions of the alt-right to achieve cultural dominance and the restoration of Western civilization, either through a political victory brought about by populism or brought about by the development of a great and heroic leadership, have been thwarted by one central element, one central problem. And that problem is the issue of modern nihilistic, consumeristic, and materialistic culture. The culture of modernity. And indeed, in both the popular case and in the case of developing new leadership, in spite of the fact that the alt-right rages against it, they are as much victims as anybody else. And because a movement based on racial identitarianism really only addresses this cultural issue tangentially, and in passing, members and leaders of the alt-right are continuously surprised when they fall into many of the same traps and pitfalls they thought were only reserved for progressives and nihilistic liberals. And I think a lot of people on the alt-right who are watching this will be very critical about this observation. I can imagine they'll say something like, well, is the problems that alt-right has in addressing modern nihilism and modern consumeristic culture really a problem with the alt-right per se? Is this specifically a problem with a racial identitarian movement? And indeed, I think it is. And to answer this question, I'm going to go back to a question that the YouTuber Friended asked me on a recent live stream. Namely, why is the primary identitarian movement in this age racially organized? Couldn't it have been religion or patriotism or something else? Now, to a certain extent, I don't think the alt-right is totally wrong. Race is sort of a natural object around which communities organize. It's not completely artificial, but I think largely the reason why this current identitarian moment organizes around race has to do with two things. First, the fact that this is fundamentally a reaction against an obsession on the left with race, on their attempts to recast class dynamics, and in particular Marxist class dynamics along the white people versus people of color spectrum. But the other reason why I think race is so popular as an organizing principle for identitarian movements is just that it's so easy. It requires absolutely no commitment on the part of the consumer who's looking out into the internet and trying to find some kind of identity. They can just tap into it instantly, and it doesn't require any kind of ideological discipline. It doesn't require any self-examination of lifestyle, because sure enough, you're going to be white no matter what you do. You're going to be white regardless if you take drugs and play video games and live a completely selfish life. And that makes race incredibly powerful as an organizing principle inside modernity when everyone is sort of enthralled to these really pathological lifestyles. It's certainly why it's been so useful for the left, but at the same time, that creates a problem, because when you're using this as your main organizing principle, you have this perfect excuse and way to sidestep the whole problem of addressing discipline, and the discipline to resist modern culture, which is necessary for any kind of civilizational counterculture movement. Unless the alt-right becomes a lot more thick with its ideology and ethics, most of its members are going to feel no pressure to actually motivate themselves to adopt a culture that will lead to the kind of organizational accomplishments the alt-right needs to accomplish any of its objectives. It's not enough to simply be against modernity. You have to introduce mechanisms to confront it, disciplines that will resist it, and movements that put identity before ethics are never going to achieve that, or at least will have a much harder time. And without a mechanism for resisting materialistic modern culture, a dissident movement will always be at the mercy of the leaders that control that materialistic culture, namely the institutions that the alt-right hopes to confront and eventually tear down. The academic, corporate, and governmental institutions of modern globalism. Are these tactical issues? Well, I suppose in some sense they are, but they're tactical problems that unearth a deeper philosophical problem. For these philosophical problems uncover a lot deeper and darker issues for the alt-right that I'll address in my later videos. So in the last two sections of this video series, I brought up two key strategic problems with the alt-right, both as they relate to using populist and democratic means of solving the problems they want to address, and also as they pertain to recruiting leaders. But part of the reason for pointing out these strategic flaws is to immediately demonstrate that the existence of these flaws on the alt-right aren't some stroke of bad luck. They emerge directly from the alt-right's identity as a racial movement. A movement with very little ideological impetus other than affiliation towards a biological identity. Indeed, the alt-right's own inability to directly confront the central problem of pathological modern culture, the alt-right's inability to directly and primarily confront the central problem of pathological modern culture, in essence, is what manufactures these two strategic problems. Now, of course, I know I'm going to get probably a lot of criticism from both the left and the alt-right listening to this series, because to this point it sounds like very weak tea. I mean, first, from the alt-right's critics, I haven't really made a moral criticism of the alt-right yet. All I have done is point out the strategic flaws and have, in some sense, linked them to an element of what the alt-right is, namely a racial identitarian movement. Moreover, on the flip side, to any alt-righters listening to this particular video, I haven't told you anything you don't already know. People on the alt-right are broadly aware that modern culture is pathological, that it leads to individualism and lack of discipline. They understand this problem. And moreover, I think they'd say something like the following: don't all movements have to deal with the issues of modernity? Certainly any political movement that's just not telling us that we should give in to total self-indulgence and individualist desires. Any movement that's going to be asserting hard realities against fantasy is going to have to come up against the problem that modern culture encourages people to embrace self-indulgent attitudes. Why, they would ask, is this only a purview of the alt-right? And I get it. As someone whose ideology largely stems from a traditionalist religion, I know that my own Catholic Church has had no easy time fighting against these very same problems. So do I have anything more to say? Is all the alt-right guilty of just ineffectiveness that stems from a cultural problem that will impede pretty much any counter-progressive movement? Well, as you might have guessed, the problem goes much deeper. And I think the first of these deeper problems stems from another leadership issue. Really, in many ways, the flip side of the previous problem. This leadership problem I like to call the Dark Knight problem. Now, a Dark Knight in popular terminology usually represents some leader that comes out of nowhere and has no connection to any other establishment, but just takes control, again in a time of crisis. But in my own analogy, I really want to contrast this figure with the figure of the White Knight. Whereas a White Knight figure would come in and take control of a society for the preservation and benefit of said society. A Dark Knight would come and take control for totally alternative motivations, perhaps even ideological or personal motivations. Whereas the White Knight's an unmitigated benefit for society, the Dark Knight's a wild card, and perhaps someone who can even do an incredible amount of damage. In essence, where the White Knight was a savior, the Dark Knight is, in some sense, an opportunist. And so the problem I think that the alt-right faces is that the movement as it stands will attract opportunistic, megalomaniac, and perhaps even psychopathic leaders. Leaders that will destroy the cause in the long run, despite the pretty words they'll tell their followers. Basically, as the movement fails to recruit and attract good leadership, it will become a beacon for terrible leadership. And I think there's a mechanism to explain this, but perhaps I can begin with an example of one such pathological leader. And of course, since we're talking about the alt-right, and I'm talking about opportunistic, short-sighted leaders, I'm sure everybody is thinking of Donald Trump. But I think there's a far more instructive example for us to examine in this particular instance. And I know I'm really going to court accusations of Godwin's Law, but really I'm speaking of none other than Adolf Hitler. And no, I'm not making the obvious, the alt-right are all Nazis canard that we hear so much from the left. I really want to examine this figure in a historical context. Now, I think because of the Holocaust, oftentimes we miss the real lesson of Adolf Hitler. Or at least one of the real lessons. We're so busy asking ourselves how bad Hitler was for Jews and Poles that we don't ask ourselves, how bad was Hitler for Germany? Because I don't care how far right you are. I don't care if you're an internet national socialist, but if you look at the objective facts, Hitler, and indeed much of the upper echelons of the Nazi Party, made decisions that drove Germany into the ground strategically and facilitated not only its ultimate destruction, but also of the total ethnic cleansing of Germans across Eastern Europe. A bloody tragedy that to this day we still hear almost nothing about. Oh, and I know people on the alt-right will whine about Stalin and Allied Bomber Command. But regardless of what you believe about Hitler's rivals, there's an inescapable fact that Hitler started the war and Hitler lost the war. Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and invaded Poland with the full knowledge this would likely result in World war with Britain and France. It was Hitler that decided to facilitate a whole Western invasion, which further pushed the Allies away from any concept of a white peace, and then compounded that error by invading the Soviet Union, and subsequently declaring war on America after Pearl Harbor. Historians even have a joke that the most valuable commander the Allied forces had on their side during the last 5 years of World War II was none less than Adolf Hitler himself. All of his decisions were strategic catastrophes for the long-term interest of his country. And why? Hitler wasn't a dumb person. Hitler was in many ways a political genius. So why the strategic blunders when it came to securing long-term livelihood for his own people? Well, that's because Hitler wasn't actually interested in the long-term livelihood or well-being of the German people. He was interested in the short-term power and prestige of the Nazi Party. And historians will say this, whether it was long-term strategic decisions about whether to go to war against Russia, or even more minor decisions about the strategy around Dunkirk and Stalingrad, every time a conflict presented itself where the needs of Germany and the Reich were pitted against the needs and prestige of the Nazi Party, Hitler always picked the Nazi Party. And that's because Hitler's priorities were prestige. The image of himself as the leader of the German people, and the image of the German people and the German race as supermen standing astride the world and conquering it. This was the egotistical dream that Hitler was addicted to. This was the egotistical dream that many of the Nazi Party adherents were addicted to. And the priority of Hitler was to perpetuate this dream, not secure prosperity and safety for future German generations. The future generations at some point needed peace, but the propaganda always needed war. You know, I've heard that psychopaths have two qualities. One is a need always to feel adored and like they're the center of attention. And another is that they have a very low sensitivity to pain. And as such, you oftentimes see psychopaths mutilating themselves or even their children and loved ones, as long as they can be the center of attention, as long as they can be part of a narrative that paints them to be the hero. And if that's the case, Hitler and the Nazi Party were one spot-on instance of psychopathy. They were perfectly willing to drive their nation into the ground as long as they were the ones at the helm when it finally hit the ground. And you know, it's a great tragedy because a unified nationalistic government in Germany in the 1930s could have been the savior of Europe under different leadership. A Germany less focused on these weird myths of racial supremacy could have worked with Poland and the other Eastern European countries to push back and possibly even depose Stalin, who had already killed millions himself. And this would have resulted in much better lives, not only for the native residents, but also for millions of Germans living in Poland, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. But of course, doing that doesn't convince your audience that you're the first scion of a 1,000-year empire of supermen. And of course, I'm well into this video, and probably most of the audience are wondering what I'm talking about. Great, I have proved that Hitler was a psychopath. Brilliant. What does this have to do with the alt-right? Well, I do not think that the election of Adolf Hitler was coincidental. There were mechanisms that made a person like that particularly appealing to people in the 1930s in Germany. And on a much lesser scale, I think the alt-right's in a similar position because of what it is, because of how it's organized, because of how it's described its own values. It will be a beacon for pathological leadership. And I think there are really two direct mechanisms for this. Now, the first mechanism, and I think this gets me back a little bit to why I felt the alt-right was fundamentally different than other dissident conservative movements, is that the alt-right is selling or providing racial identity and racial pride with really no prior ethical or ideological commitment. Now, people, and especially young men, are really in search of identity. It's something that we crave. And coming into contact with it on the alt-right feels good. It feels right. It feels natural. And there's even sort of, I think, an addictive quality to it. Now I know what people on the alt-right will say. This is nationalism. This is group solidarity. This is something that every one of our ancestors would have had access to, would have been able to feel, real. It wouldn't have been questioned in previous ages. And to a large degree, they're absolutely right. This would have been naturally a part of any society before 60 years ago. But there's a problem because it would have been quite different. Pride in the group and identity with the group wouldn't have been sold in isolation. There would be an accompanying sense of duty, and that duty would stem from an even larger concept of ethics, an ethical obligation. I mean, you might feel proud to be German in 1910, but that wouldn't be some abstract notion that you just hold into yourself and feel warm and glowy. It would manifest itself in a need to volunteer, to actually help a real society you see in front of yourself, to actually help real people. But in the case of the alt-right as a movement, this racial and group identity is sold without any accompanying contact or loyalty to some real society. It's all hypothetical. It's all in the future. And if anything, contact with the alt-right facilitates a deep antipathy towards the outside society. Now, of course, in some sense, the societies deserve that, but it's an important observation to make because it makes this particular phenomenon different from those that have come before it. And of course, here I want to point out something that's critical, because as much as the alt-right rages against modernity, and it's certainly right to do that, it itself is a product of modernity. It's selling racial pride in group identity, divorced from the cost of racial pride in group identity. It's an off-the-shelf pleasure at a click for something that would have in the past ages had been paid for by duty. And as such, it segues incredibly nicely into somebody thoroughly pathologically addicted to modernity, to indolence, to consumerism. Racial pride is easy. It feels good. And so it's no surprise that you see all these people doing pornographic alt-right memes with anime girls in SS uniforms. It's consumeristic. But of course, the consumerism isn't the main issue. The issue is you're creating an audience of people whose primary loyalty is not to a real society or to a real people, but to a grandiose notion of a racially pure society in a past that may not have even really existed in the way it's being portrayed. The people who consume alt-right media may very well not be concerned with the real community. They're concerned with the hypothetical one and the identity that the hypothetical community conveys to them. In many cases, it might be loyalty to a fantasy, and I'm saying that as somebody who thinks loyalty to a people and to a nation is perfectly healthy. But the particular way it's developing online may not be. But of course, how does this lead to the problems of megalomaniacal leaders? Well, there's another big mechanism also in play here, and this really has more to do with the left than the right, and that is paranoia. Somewhat justified paranoia, but paranoia nonetheless. The left is on a witch hunt for racists. Everybody knows that. But as left increases to turn the thumbscrews, creating more and more penalties for people who dissent on the subjects of race, the alt-right will be increasingly on the lookout for leaders who can bravely flaunt the taboos and shove the standards in the face of the left. And indeed, there's good reason for this. As the pressure goes up, the right will see many of its leaders cuck and essentially sell out their own movements to keep their position in the power hierarchy. And there will be demand for a leader that people can trust on the right. But how can you trust anyone when the left keeps on cutting sweeter and sweeter deals for those who defect and putting more and more punishments on those who don't? So how do you solve this problem in the leadership? Well, obviously, by counter-signaling, by looking for leaders who take more extreme and more extreme and more extreme positions, to the point where the left won't buy them off because the left doesn't want them. I mean, a leader who dresses and looks like David Brooks might always sell you out and call the movement you belong to racist, but the guy who has a tattoo of a swastika on his forehead, you know he's solid. And so, as the strategic problems that I mentioned in the first two videos cause the alt-right to take loss after loss politically and culturally, the right, and indeed the alt-right in particular, is going to have a growing number of depressed, despondent members, desperate to see some leader, any leader who could possibly turn back the tide. Somebody who, first, won't betray them, and second, will have the courage to get things done and really confront their enemies in the most brutal possible terms. The extremeness and even the insanity of those leaders won't be a bug, they'll be features. And thus, you have the two main components of what I would argue leads to a pathological and megalomaniacal leader. A group of people who associate with and are identify with a hypothetical community more than they do a real one, and a paranoid growing demand for extremism in order to counter-signal against the perceived enemy. The result is not hard to see in terms of leadership. The community will hoist up any extreme leader who will promise to preserve this identity, who will promise to bring forth this future hypothetical community, and mostly who presents himself as willing to go to any ends to accomplish these tasks, even to the extent that he might harm the real, living communities his own group occupies in order to celebrate and procure the hypothetical future. If a community demands leaders like this, it's a psychopath's dream, because it perfectly accommodates their need for adoration, along with their callousness towards actual people's lives. And I think this is a huge problem, because the alt-right, if it's organized and works the way it does now, will attract these leaders. Now, before I close out this section, I think I need to make one big clarification for the alt-right listeners who might be watching this video. I know the alt-right isn't comprised of sociopaths. I've met a lot of alt-right people on the internet in the last year, and for the most part, they tend to be very friendly people. In fact, as I have mentioned before, there are many alt-right YouTubers, most prominently among them Reactionary Expat and Millennial Woes, who I really admire. And when I made my initial video saying that I was going to do a series about what's wrong with the alt-right, and indeed when I finished that series by saying that the alt-right would lead the West to ruin, I did feel for a moment like I was being too harsh, and that people like Millennial Woes might take this personally. But believe me when I say, this is my genuine concern, because in spite of the fact that I've met many good people in the alt-right, I've also experienced the converse. More than a few people that I felt have had deeply callous and perhaps even psychopathic personalities, people who would go to any length. And indeed, these people are minor, they don't have big YouTube channels. All movements have got weirdos and crazies sticking on the sides. But the movement as it stands isn't what concerns me, because I think I know what direction this is going. As the alt-right advances, as it staggers and takes losses, the rank and file aren't going to want leaders who ruminate thoughtfully on the problems of modernity and wistfully look back. In the future, the alt-right is going to want action. They're going to want men of action, extreme men of action, people who will set the world on fire. And for a movement entirely based on affinity towards a future white racialist movement that does not yet exist, I'm not so sure what will be restraining those leaders. I know the callous exists in every movement, but there's a future in the alt-right that will demand that the callous take the reins. And that frankly scares me, though I'll touch on that a little more in future videos.